We're going to be looking at 4 different market structures in this course. And today we'll look at the first one, which is called perfect competition. But let me just list the other ones as well. The second one we'll look at is monopoly. And then probably after the test number 2, we'll look at something called oligopoly. And then finally, we'll be looking at something called monopolistic competition. These are archetypes. These are kind of extreme cases. Just quickly take a quick glance at the distinction between them. The key distinction is that the questions are whether there's easy or difficult to enter or exit the market. Sometimes it's referred to as barriers to entry. And then the second question is how many participants are in the market, particularly how many firms. In the case of perfect competition, there are many buyers, many sellers, and there's a free entry, free exit. That means it's relatively simple to get enter or exit the market. The consequence of these two assumptions is that all participants are price takers, so that means there's no negotiating, there's no game theory applied here. The second case we'll look at is monopoly, which means that there's a single seller, and necessarily then there's no free entry. There's a barrier to entry. On the other side, of course, that there's many buyers of the product or good or whatever being sold. Oligopoly is similar to monopoly, but in this case there are several sellers. But critically, and we'll see that often this question of entry is rather critical and it changes the nature of the market. There's no free entry, so there's barriers to entry, but there are several sellers. Finally, monopolistic competition is very similar to perfect competition, except that the good that's being sold is differentiated. That means it's slightly different. We'll look at this at the very end. So let's now take a look at this concept this cost structure in the context of perfect competition. So we have the cost curve that we saw before, where we've got total cost, total variable cost, and then total fixed cost, which just pushes the whole total cost curve upwards. Keep in mind that these curves are determined by technology and also the assumption that the firms are minimizing their costs. So they're using the technology in the best way possible. And the simple equation is that the total cost is composed of the fixed cost, like a sunk cost, like signing a lease for money that's spent or agreed to be spent in the past. It could also be interpreted as being the expected return on an investment, plus the variable costs. These are costs that can change, in effect, day to day by hiring workers and so on. Wages, fuel costs, and things like that. So keep in mind, too, that in this context of perfect competition, the firm can control the quantity produced, but it can't control the shape of these curves. And critically, of course, it can't control the selling price. So it's a bit like an employee that goes and accepts a job at minimum wage. Well, they can't negotiate a higher wage. Now, let's take a look at the market from the perspective of the entire industry, the entire market. So we're looking at all buyers and all sellers here, not one individual firm. So the supply curve is many suppliers that are selling oysters or whatever, they're widgets. And let's say this is the current market price. Now let's say, for the sake of argument, that something changes. For example, maybe new technology reduces the cost of making a substitute good. So, for example, like ATM machines, it's possible now to offer services of banking services without having to go to a teller. So in a circumstance like this, if we were looking at now the quantity of tellers that are available, we'd expect the demand curve to shift to the left, lower demand for this particular product or service. And now we'd expect to see the market price fall to P2, and that's what we're going to be examining in this video. So let's see what the consequence of this is for the first graph we looked at. So we can see is that the initial P1 before the change, the total revenue curve looks like this. Notice that it's got a constant slope, and the slope is equal to the price. And as the firm were to sell more of the good, the price doesn't change. So it's a straight line, constant slope. Now, the objective of the firm is to maximize the difference between the total revenue, the total cost. That's the economic rent or the economic profit. Now, if the price falls because of some external change, then we draw a new total revenue curve lower with P2, as I've illustrated here. Now, in this case, the firm wants to minimize its losses. It's economic loss. It's still earning more than the variable cost, but it's less than the total cost, so it's not covering its fixed cost. And in this case, the economic profit will be negative, and it wants to minimize this distance here. Now, we're going to take a look at this with the second set of curves. Notice here on the axes, we've changed this now to the average cost, average variable cost, and marginal cost, whereas before we were looking at the total cost, total variable cost. So we've seen these curves these numbers before. We're going to assume under perfect competition that the firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve, which we can show in this graph as a straight line, P1, for example. Now, in this case, remember that the firm will choose to produce where the price is equal to the marginal cost. So we can draw the quantity line vertically like this. This Q1 tells us how much this particular, now we're looking at individual firm, not the entire market. An individual firm will choose to produce at Q1 because that's where it maximizes its economic profit. If, on the other hand, the price falls to P2, well, then in this case, the firm would choose this point over here where the marginal cost is equal to the price. It would reduce the quantity produced and sold to Q2. So this is how we look at a change in the price in these two different cost, two different types of graphs of the costs. In this sense, looking at this case again, where we've got the average cost, the average variable cost, and marginal cost on the vertical axes, there are three regions that we're very interested in. The first region is this portion here above the average cost curve, which I'll just call region 1. The second is region 2, which is between the average cost curve and the average variable cost. And then finally, region 3, which is this section below the average variable cost. And I'm going to look at each one of these individually to see what the response of the firm, or what the situation of an individual firm will be. Keep in mind that the price changes for external reasons. Change in the demand curve, change in the technology of another industry, things like that. These curves, on the other hand, are fixed through all of these various price changes. So if if the price is in this area of region 1, then we can say that the price is above the average cost, which necessarily means that total revenue is greater than total cost. We can see it here. And this means that the firm is going to be choosing this point Q1, as illustrated before. This entire area, P times Q, represents the total revenue. So this is the cash that's coming into the cash registers of the firm. On the other hand, we can see what the total cost is, and it's going to be the average cost times the quantity. So it's this area here. And the difference between the two is the economic profit, which we can see here now is a positive. It's greater than 0, which means that it's going to be attractive to competitors. Firms would want to get into this market, as we saw before with newspapers and chocolate bars. So if the price, on the other hand, is in this region 2, for example, this section here, then we can say that now the price is lower than the average cost, but it's greater than the average variable cost. The firm chooses to produce at this point Q2. We can see the average cost times quantity represents the total cost. Notice that the price is greater than the average cost. This region here is the total cost, average cost times quantity. The revenue, on the other hand, is smaller. As we can see up here, the total revenue is less than the total cost. So that means to say the economic profit is negative. We can see it here in this area, which means that in region 2, firms are not attracted into this market. They don't want to enter. And furthermore, this firm itself wants to leave. This is the case where the guy signed the lease for renting, having a car to drive it with Uber. And when he gets back at the end of the day, he's covered his average variable costs. But on the other hand, he doesn't cover the cost of the lease. So when the lease is due at the end of the year, he wants to get out of this Uber business. Similarly, if a firm has a retail store of some sort, they cover the costs of hiring somebody and the cost of the goods sold, but they're not making money. It's not a good deal from the standpoint of the lease that they've signed for the next year of having this storefront. So as soon as the lease is up, they'd want to leave the business. The third region we're going to look at is this area where the price is lower than the average variable cost. I've shown it here as price is down this low here, in which case, once again, normally we'd expect that the quantity sold would be when the price is equal to the marginal cost. Notice the price is less than the average variable cost, but in this case, the firm will actually shut down. And so it's incorrect to show that this is Q3 here. It would in fact be this amount over here. Anytime the price is below the average variable cost, the guy's going to leave his car parked in front of his house. He's not going to drive it, because in effect what it's saying is that if he drives all day and comes home, he has less money in his pocket than he had at 8 o'clock, because once he's paid for the gasoline costs and his time and things like that. So it's having a store, for example, where you simply don't sell enough even to cover the wages of the employee that you've got handling the sales. So rather than lose money running it as a charity, you'd shut down. So in region 3, we'd expect to see the quantity equal to 0. We can see it here is that the price is lower than the average variable cost.